The jagged blade that ripped into Sujin's side didn't finish him, but the nurse who patched him up in that rain-slicked alley might just be his downfall. It was a suffocating Friday night in the city, the kind of night where the shadows are thick enough to hide a murder, but never a guilty conscience. Peggy Martin spent her life following the rules, but the one time she broke them, she saved the man who would burn the city down to keep her. She thought she was simply answering a desperate groan behind a dumpster. She thought she could apply pressure to the wound, step back into the sterilized safety of the hospital, and forget the terrifying weight of his dark, obsidian eyes. She was wrong. In the world of the syndicate, mercy is a currency most people can't afford to spend. 6 hours after she kept his heart beating, the most feared man in the city opened his eyes, touched the makeshift bandage on his ribs, and gave an order that made the room go cold. "Bring me that nurse, and tell her she's not going home." The fluorescent light in the staff lounge hummed with a sick, flickering rhythm. On the vending machine outside, the word "open" had burned out, leaving only a dim red warning. It felt like a cruel joke, Peggy thought, staring at the blood still caught under her fingernails. On this side of the city, nobody risked their neck for a stranger, especially not at 3 a.m. Peggy rubbed her eyes, the smell of industrial soap and cheap hospital coffee doing nothing to mask the lingering scent of rain and copper. The rain didn't just fall on the south side, it punished. Peggy Martin pulled her cardigan tighter around her scrubs, the damp chill of the midnight air seeping into her bones as she stepped out of the hospital's rear exit for a breath of air that didn't smell like industrial floor wax. She had spent 12 hours charting vitals and dodging the temper of a head nurse who lived by the clock, and all she wanted was the silence of her walk home. But the city never stayed silent. A heavy, wet thud echoed from the mouth of the alley adjacent to the loading docks, followed by a low guttural groan that set Peggy's pulse racing. It was a sound she recognized from years in the ER, the sound of a man losing the fight against his own body. Every rule in the hospital handbook told her to go back inside, to call security, to stay within the lines of her shift. Instead, Peggy found her feet moving toward the shadows. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rhythmic thud of the rain. She rounded a rusted dumpster and froze. Propped against a soot-stained brick wall was a man who looked less like a patient and more like a fallen god of the underworld. He was massive, his broad shoulders straining against a bespoke suit jacket that was now ruined, soaked through with a terrifying amount of crimson. Even in the dim light of a flickering street lamp, Peggy could see the intricate black ink of tattoos snaking up his neck and disappearing under his collar. The jagged blade that ripped into Sujin's side didn't finish him, but the nurse who patched him up in that rain-slicked alley might just be his downfall. It was a suffocating Friday night in the city, the kind of night where the shadows are thick enough to hide a murder, but never a guilty conscience. Peggy Martin spent her life following the rules, but the one time she broke them, she saved the man who would burn the city down to keep her. She thought she was simply answering a desperate groan behind a dumpster. She thought she could apply pressure to the wound, step back into the sterilized safety of the hospital, and forget the terrifying weight of his dark, obsidian eyes. She was wrong. In the world of the syndicate, mercy is a currency most people can't afford to spend. 6 hours after she kept his heart beating, the most feared man in the city opened his eyes, touched the makeshift bandage on his ribs, and gave an order that made the room go cold. "Bring me that nurse, and tell her she's not going home." The fluorescent light in the staff lounge hummed with a sick, flickering rhythm. On the vending machine outside, the word "open" had burned out, leaving only a dim red warning. It felt like a cruel joke, Peggy thought, staring at the blood still caught under her fingernails. On this side of the city, nobody risked their neck for a stranger, especially not at 3 a.m. Peggy rubbed her eyes, the smell of industrial soap and cheap hospital coffee doing nothing to mask the lingering scent of rain and copper. The rain didn't just fall on the south side, it punished. Peggy Martin pulled her cardigan tighter around her scrubs, the damp chill of the midnight air seeping into her bones as she stepped out of the hospital's rear exit for a breath of air that didn't smell like industrial floor wax. She had spent 12 hours charting vitals and dodging the temper of a head nurse who lived by the clock, and all she wanted was the silence of her walk home. But the city never stayed silent. A heavy, wet thud echoed from the mouth of the alley adjacent to the loading docks, followed by a low, guttural groan that set Peggy's pulse racing. It was a sound she recognized from years in the ER, the sound of a man losing the fight against his own body. Every rule in the hospital handbook told her to go back inside, to call security, to stay within the lines of her shift. Instead, Peggy found her feet moving toward the shadows. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rhythmic thud of the rain. She rounded a rusted dumpster and froze. Propped against a soot-stained brick wall was a man who looked less like a patient and more like a fallen bad of the underworld. He was massive, his broad shoulders straining against a bespoke suit jacket that was now ruined, soaked through with a terrifying amount of crimson. Even in the dim light of a flickering street lamp, Peggy could see the intricate black ink of tattoos snaking up his neck and disappearing under his collar.
Soo-jin. She didn't need to be told his name. His face was the ghost that haunted every local news broadcast and every whispered warning in the break room. He was the man who owned the shadows Peggy was currently standing in. His head lolled back against the brick, his skin the color of wet ash. Beside him, two figures materialized from the darkness like specters. They were dressed in sharp, dark overcoats, their hands tucked significantly into their pockets. The cold, mechanical click of a safety being disengaged echoed through the narrow space. "Keep walking, nurse," one of the men growled, his voice a jagged edge. "You didn't see anything." Peggy looked at the gun, then at the man dying against the wall. Her hands were shaking, but the instinct, the deep, marrow-deep need to preserve life took over. "He's hemorrhaging," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "If I keep walking, he's dead in 3 minutes. That arterial spray on the bricks, that's his life running out." The guards hesitated, glancing at each other. Peggy didn't wait for their permission. She dropped to her knees in the oily puddle beside Soo-jin, the cold water soaking into her pants instantly. She ignored the guards and focused on the man. His eyes flickered open, obsidian depths that seemed to swallow the light. Even half-conscious, his gaze was a physical weight, a dark pressure that demanded submission. "Don't touch," he rasped, the words thick with blood. "I'm a nurse, Soo-jin. Being stubborn isn't gonna fix a ruptured artery," Peggy snapped, her professional mask sliding into place. She reached into her deep scrub pockets, pulling out a roll of medical tape, a pair of trauma shears she'd forgotten to return to the station, and a stack of sterile gauze she always kept for emergencies. She ripped his shirt open, exposing a torso built of hard muscle and scarred skin. The wound was jagged, a deep tear from a blade that had been meant to disembowel. She pressed her hands directly into the heat of the wound. Soo-jin let out a sound that was half hiss, half roar, his hand suddenly shoot out to catch Peggy's throat. His grip wasn't tight enough to choke, but it was a promise of what he could do if he chose. "You have to let me," Peggy whispered, looking directly into those terrifying eyes. "Hold me if you have to, but let me save you." For a heartbeat, the only sound was the rain and the heavy, ragged breathing of a predator. Then, slowly, his hand slid from her throat to her shoulder, his fingers digging into her scrubs with a strength that suggested he was pinning her to the earth. Peggy worked with a frantic, focused grace. She used the trauma shears to cut her own cardigan into strips, creating a makeshift pressure dressing, reinforced by the gauze. The guards stood like statues, their shadows stretching long and menacing over her as she fought the flow of red. She was breaking every rule, practicing medicine without a license in a back alley, aiding a known criminal, stealing supplies. But as she felt the pulse under her fingers stabilize, the fear was replaced by a strange electric clarity.
She looked up, her face splattered with rain and his blood. The bleeding is controlled for now, but he needs a surgeon and a sterile field. If you take him to the ER through the front doors, his enemies will know he survived before the anesthesia even kicks in. Sujin's eyes tracked her every movement, his breathing shallow but rhythmic. He didn't thank her, he didn't move. He simply watched her with a predatory intensity, as if he were memorizing the curve of her jaw and the fire in her eyes. "We take him to the private wing," the taller guard commanded, reaching down to hoist Sujin up. As they dragged him away into the waiting mouth of a black sedan that had pulled up silently, Sujin looked back over his shoulder. The rain washed over his face, making him look like a marble statue of a vengeful saint. He didn't say a word, but the look he gave Peggy wasn't one of gratitude. It was a claim. Peggy stood alone in the alley, her hands stained a deep, indelible red. She had saved the devil, and as the taillights of the sedan vanished into the mist, she realized that the rules she had lived by her entire life had just been burned to ash.
"You," the guard said, his voice a low rumble that carried the weight of a direct command. "Boss is awake. He's done with the circus. He says he only wants the girl from the alley." I'm off duty," Peggy stammered, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. I was just leaving." "You aren't going anywhere," the guard replied, stepping aside to reveal the entrance to the suite. "He doesn't trust the hands he can buy. He only trusts the ones that didn't flinch when the gun was at their head." The administrators moved aside like the parting of a sea, their expressions shifting from confusion to a desperate, silent plea. They didn't care who Peggy was or why a Mafia kingpin wanted her. They just wanted the monster in room 402 to stop growling. Peggy walked forward, her clogs clicking rhythmically against the linoleum. Every instinct told her to run for the emergency exit, to change her name and move 3 states away. But as she reached the threshold, she remembered the way Sujin had looked at her in the rain, not as a victim, but as a force. She entered the room. The air inside smelled an expensive cologne and antiseptic. Sujin was propped up against the pillows, his chest bare and wrapped in the professional bandages the surgical team had applied. The tattoos on his skin seemed to pulse in the sterile light. He looked less like a patient and more like a king presiding over a ruined court. Beside the bed, a shattered glass pitcher lay in a puddle on the floor, a testament to his earlier temper. The moment Peggy stepped inside, the tension in his massive frame seemed to shift, though not soften. His obsidian eyes, now clear and dangerously sharp, tracked her every movement. "The girl with the steady hands," he rasped. The sound was like gravel over silk. "My name's Peggy Martin," her voice firmer than she felt. She walked to the edge of the bed, ignoring the guard who lingered at the door. She looked at the monitors, then at the dressing on his side. "And if you keep throwing things, you're going to tear the internal sutures I worked very hard to place in the dark." A ghost of a smirk touched his lips, a terrifying, beautiful expression that made Peggy's breath hitch. He didn't look like a man who had almost died 6 hours ago. He looked like a man who was deciding exactly what to do with the woman who had dared to save him. "The doctors here, they smell of fear and greed. They look at me and see a paycheck or a coffin. You looked at me and saw a man who was leaking." He reached out, his hand slow and deliberate. Peggy didn't pull away. He didn't grab her throat this time. Instead, he caught the hem of her scrub sleeve, his fingers brushing against her wrist, where her pulse was jumping erratically. "I don't like being in debt, Peggy Martin," he whispered,
his gaze locking onto hers with a possessive intensity that made the rest of the world vanish. He turned his head toward the administrators hovering anxiously in the hallway and spoke loud enough for the entire floor to hear. "Clear the wing. No doctors, no specialists, only her. If I see another face in this room that isn't hers, I'll burn this wing to the ground with everyone in it." The shock of the order rippled through the hall. Peggy looked out at her bosses, the people who held her career in their hands, and saw that they were already nodding, already surrendering her to the man in the bed. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was a prisoner in a suite made of gold and glass. Soo-jin pulled her a fraction of an inch closer, his eyes dark with a secret, dangerous promise. "You saved my life, Nurse Martin. Now you're going to help me keep it, and in return, I might just let you keep yours." The sun had barely begun to bleed through the smog of the Chicago skyline when the weight of Peggy's new reality truly settled. She was standing in the small, glass-walled break room of the VIP wing, staring at a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The events of the last 12 hours, the blood in the alley, the obsidian depth of Soo-jin's gaze, and that bone-chilling order felt like a fever dream that refused to break. The door hissed open, and Peggy didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The scent of expensive clinical soap and the heavy, rhythmic gait of the chief of surgery, Dr. Aristor. Beside him stood a man in a sharp slate-gray suit that Peggy recognized as Soo-jin's legal counsel, a man whose smile was as sharp and predatory as a shark's fin.
"Nurse Martin," Dr. Aristor began, his voice lacking its usual booming authority. He looked like a man who hadn't slept, or perhaps a man who had realized he was no longer the highest power in his own hospital. "We've been reviewing the unusual circumstances of last night, specifically your presence in an unauthorized area and the use of hospital supplies off-site." Peggy felt the floor tilt. "I was saving a life, doctor. Protocol says you are an ER resident, not a street medic," the lawyer interrupted, his voice smooth and devoid of empathy. He stepped forward, laying a thin manila folder on the break room table. "The board is concerned, Peggy. There are questions about the theft of medical narcotics, the lack of a sterile field, and the liability you've placed on this institution. Under normal circumstances, your license would be revoked before lunch. You'd never touch a stethoscope again." Peggy's breath hitched. Her nursing license wasn't just a piece of paper, it was her life. It was the only thing that kept her above the poverty line that had swallowed her parents. "You can't do that. I did what was right." "Right and legal are rarely on speaking terms in this city," the lawyer said, his eyes narrowing. "However, Mr. Soo-jin is a very grateful man. He has offered to settle all administrative discrepancies on your behalf. In fact, he's made a very generous donation to the hospital's new surgical wing, but it comes with a condition." Dr. Aristor wouldn't look her in the eye. He stared at the cold coffee on the table. "Soo-jin has requested, no, demanded, a private around-the-clock medical liaison for the duration of his recovery. He has specifically named you, Peggy. You will be transferred from the ER to his personal service, effective immediately. You will stay in the adjoining suite. You will be his shadow." 24 hours a day? Peggy whispered, the horror of the realization sinking in. "That's not a nursing shift. That's a kidnapping." "It's a career-saving opportunity," the lawyer corrected, his tone turning cold. "You have two choices, Nurse Martin. You can sign this agreement, and by the time Soo-jin is discharged, your record will be spotless and your debt to this hospital cleared. Or you can walk out that door, but if you do, I personally guarantee that by the time you reach the parking garage, every hospital in the country will have a red flag on your name. You'll be lucky to find work cleaning bedpans in a condemned nursing home."
The silence in the room was deafening, punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic beep of monitors from the hallway. Peggy looked through the break room glass toward room 402. She could see the silhouette of a guard standing outside the door, a physical reminder of the cage being built around her. She wasn't being asked, she was being owned. Sujin didn't just want her medical skills, he wanted the woman who had seen his vulnerability and hadn't run. He was turning her compassion into a leash. "I have a life," Peggy said, though the words felt hollow even to her. "I have a family." "Mr. Sujin is well aware of your Aunt Martha in Ohio," the lawyer said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly casual pitch. "He has already arranged for a private security detail to watch her house, just to ensure she stays safe while you're busy taking care of him." The threat was veiled in silk, but it hit Peggy like a physical blow. They weren't just threatening her career, they were holding her world hostage. She looked at the signature line on the contract. It felt like a death warrant for the woman she used to be, the rule follower, the girl who believed that doing good was enough. With a hand that shook despite her best efforts to keep it steady, Peggy picked up the pen. As the ink hit the paper, she felt a strange, cold sensation in her chest. The golden handcuffs were locked. "Excellent choice," the lawyer said, snatching the paper away before the ink was even dry. "Go get your things, Nurse Martin. Your patient is waiting. And remember, he doesn't like to be kept waiting." Peggy walked back to the VIP suite, her feet feeling heavy, as if she were walking through the same thick Chicago mud from the night before. When she entered room 402, Sujin was staring at the door, as if he had known the exact second she would submit. "You're signed," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "I didn't have a choice," Peggy snapped, dropping her bag onto the leather chair by the window. Sujin's eyes tracked her, a slow, dark satisfaction spreading across his face. He leaned back against the pillows, the power in the room shifting toward him like a tide. "Choice is an illusion for people like us, Peggy. There is only survival. And from now on, your survival depends entirely on mine." He held out his hand, gesturing for her to check his vitals. As Peggy wrapped the blood pressure cuff around his massive arm, his fingers brushed against her wrist, tracing the spot where her pulse was leaping. He smiled, a predatory, secret thing. Peggy realized then that she hadn't just saved a man, she had invited a predator into her life, and he had no intention of ever letting her go. The transition from ER nurse to private shadow felt like a slow-motion descent into a world made of velvet and razor wire. For 3 days, Peggy had lived within the 4 walls of the VIP suite, her world reduced to the rhythmic beep of Sujin's vitals and the heavy, silent presence of his guards at the door. She had become an island, isolated from the hospital staff who now looked at her with a mix of pity and suspicion. Sujin was a difficult patient, not because he complained, but because he was too observant. He watched her prepare his dressings with a terrifying focus, as if he were trying to decode the very rhythm of her soul. But today, the air in the room felt different. It was thin, charged with a static Peggy couldn't name. It started with a routine change of his IV bag. At 2 p.m., a young pharmacy tech Peggy didn't recognize, a man with darting eyes and hands that fumbled with the plastic seal, delivered the pre-mixed antibiotic solution. Usually, the meds were delivered by the head floor nurse, but Dr. Aristor had signed off on a streamlined delivery protocol specifically for the VIP wing. Peggy hung the bag, her fingers moving with the muscle memory of 1,000 shifts. She was about to open the line when a faint, sweet scent hit her, an odor like crushed almonds, nearly masked by the sterile smell of the plastic. She froze. Antibiotics didn't smell sweet. She looked at the label. It was printed correctly, bearing the hospital's official watermark and Sujin's patient ID. But as she held the bag up to the light, she noticed a tiny, almost invisible prick near the injection port, a microscopic breach in the seal that shouldn't have been there. "Is there a problem, Peggy?" Sujin's voice rasping from the bed made her heart jolt. He was propped up, his dark eyes narrowed as he watched her hesitate. "I need to double-check the concentration," she lied, her voice tight. "The pharmacy has been making errors lately." "You're a bad liar," Sujin said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. "Your hands are shaking." Peggy didn't answer. She took a sterile syringe and drew a small sample from the bag, moving to the small kitchenette in the corner of the suite. She knew the chemical profile of the standard antibiotics Sujin was supposed to be receiving. She also knew that certain concentrated sedatives and paralytics, when mixed with high-dose potassium, created a lethal cocktail that would look like a simple cardiac arrest in a recovering trauma patient. It was the perfect hospital murder. Using a rapid testing strip she'd swiped from the lab earlier that morning, she watched the paper turn a violent, bruised purple. It wasn't antibiotics. It was a concentrated dose of vecuronium, a paralytic used in intubation, but at this dosage, it would stop his heart in seconds. The room seemed to tilt. This wasn't a mistake. This was an execution, and she was supposed to be the one to pull the trigger. "Peggy," commanded Sujin.
She turned back to him, the testing strip hidden in her palm. "The bag is tainted," she whispered, walking to the bed. Her professional distance was crumbling, replaced by a cold, visceral terror. "Someone replaced your meds. If I had opened that line, you'd be dead before I could call a code blue." Sujin didn't look surprised. A dark, wary cynicism settled over his features, making him look older, more formidable. He reached out, his large hand wrapping around her forearm, pulling her closer until she was leaning over the bed rails. "Who delivered it?" he asked, the words vibrating with a lethal intent. "A tech I didn't recognize, but the order, it was signed off by the chief of staff, by Aristor." The realization hit her like a physical blow. The man who had threatened her license, the man who had forced her into this golden cage, was the same man clearing the path for Sujin's killers. She wasn't just his nurse, she was his unintended accomplice. Sujin's grip on her arm tightened, his thumb pressing against the pulse point in her wrist. "Now you see the truth of the world you've entered, Peggy. The men in white coats are just as bloodthirsty as the men in the alleys. They just use pens instead of blades." "I have to report this, Peggy," said her mind racing. "I have to take this to the police." "The police are a ledger I've already bought, and my enemies have outbid me," Sujin said, his eyes burning into hers. "If you leave this room with that bag, you won't make it to the elevators. Aristor can't afford to let you be a witness." Peggy looked at the IV bag, then back at Sujin. She was a rule follower, a woman who believed in the system, but the system was currently trying to turn her into a murderer. "What do I do?" asked Peggy, her voice trembling. Sujin pulled her closer, his face inches from hers. The scent of him, smoke and cold iron, overpowered the hospital's antiseptic. "You do exactly what I tell you. You hang a dummy bag of saline, you tell them I'm resting, and you realize that from this moment on, I am the only person in this building who isn't trying to kill you." He let go of her arm, but the mark of his fingers remained on her skin like a brand. Peggy took the tainted bag and hid it deep in her medical waste bin, replacing it with a clean bag of fluids. As she stood there, watching the clear liquid drip into the chamber, she realized the hospital was no longer a sanctuary. It was a battlefield, and she had just picked a side. The silence in the VIP suite tonight was different tonight. It wasn't the sterile, heavy silence of a hospital wing, but the vibrating stillness of a predatory animal at rest. Peggy moved through the shadows of the room, her silhouette cast long and thin by the dim glow of the city lights bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She checked the monitors, her eyes scanning the jagged lines of Sujin's heart rate with a clinical detachment she didn't truly feel. Since the discovery of the poisoned IV, the air between them had shifted. The walls of the hospital no longer felt like a barrier against the world. They felt like the bars of a cage they were both trapped in. Every time a floorboard creaked in the hallway or a distant siren wailed, Peggy's hand drifted toward the medical waste bin where the tainted bag remained hidden, a silent piece of evidence that her world had turned into a graveyard of ethics. Soo-jin's grip on her arm tightened, his thumb pressing against the pulse point in her wrist. Now you see the truth of the world you've entered, Peggy. The men in white coats are just as bloodthirsty as the men in the alleys. They just use pens instead of blades. You haven't slept, he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in the very floorboards beneath Peggy's feet. I'm your nurse, Soo-jin. I don't sleep on the clock. You aren't on a clock anymore, Peggy Martin. You're in a war. And in a war, the first thing you lose is the luxury of rest. He shifted, a wince expression crossing his face as his internal sutures pulled. Peggy was at his side in a second, her hands moving instinctively to his shoulder to steady him. Stop moving! You're going to cause a hematoma!
He caught her wrist, his grip surprisingly gentle but immovable. He didn't pull her away, he held her there, right in the space where the sterile hospital air met the warmth of his skin. He looked up at her, his obsidian eyes searching hers with a terrifying clarity. Why haven't you run? He asked softly. I gave the order to keep you here, yes. But a woman like you know how to vanish. You could have walked out of that pharmacy lab and never looked back. Why stay for a man who represents everything you were taught to hate? Peggy looked down at his hand on her wrist, then back at his face. The truth was a tangled knot in her chest. I took an oath. Do no harm. If I leave, they kill you. That makes me the one who did the harm. Soo-jin let out a short, dark laugh that ended in a huff of pain. Oaths. Men like Eristhor take oaths every day. They swear to protect the public while they tout the silver in their pockets. They look at me and see a monster to be put down or a bill to be padded. Even my own men. They look at me and see a throne they might one day sit on. He pulled her slightly closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a secret shared in a confessional. But you, in that alley, with the rain washing the life out of me and the barrel of a gun inches from your head, you didn't ask. What? Peggy whispered. You didn't ask who I was, Soo-jin said, his gaze intense. You didn't ask if I deserved to live. You didn't ask if I had killed people or if I was worth the risk of your career. You saw a human being in pain and you acted. You were the only person in 34 years who saw me before they saw the boss. The honesty in his voice was more disarming than any weapon he could have wielded. Peggy felt a lump form in her throat. She had spent her life trying to be invisible, trying to be the perfect, silent healer who followed every line of the code. She hadn't realized that her simple act of humanity had been the most radical thing she'd ever done. I chose you because you are the only thing in this city that isn't for sale, he continued, his fingers tracing the underside of her wrist, right over her leaping pulse. And because as long as you are standing between me and the needle, I know I'm safe. Not because of your medicine, but because of your soul. Peggy pulled her hand back, but the heat of his touch lingered like a brand. She felt a dangerous magnetic pull toward him, a man who was a predator, a criminal, a king. He was the silent protector of his own dark empire, and now he had made her the protector of his life. I'm just a nurse, Soo-jin, though the words sounded hollow. No, he replied, his eyes never leaving hers as he settled back into the bed. You're the only reason the devil is still breathing, and in this city, that makes you the most dangerous woman alive. As Peggy turned back to the monitors, her heart was no longer in sync with the rhythmic beeps of the machines. The rules were gone. The hospital was a fortress, and she was the only one holding the keys to the kingdom. She looked at the door where the shadows of his guards stood watch and realized for the first time that they weren't just keeping her in, they were keeping the rest of the world out. The institutional weight of the hospital had always felt like a sanctuary to Peggy, but lately the white corridors felt more like a gauntlet. It was mid-morning on her 5th day of captivity in the VIP wing when she stepped out to the nurse's station to request a fresh supply of sterile irrigation saline. The air outside room 402 was thick with the usual hospital hum, yet the staff avoided her eyes as if she were carrying a contagion. She was halfway back to the suite when a hand clamped firmly onto her elbow, the grip tight enough to bruise. She was spun around to face Harold Vance, the vice chairman of the hospital board. Vance was a man who wore his influence like a weapon, his expensive silk tie contrasting sharply with the cold, calculating look in his eyes. "Nurse Martin," Vance said, his voice a low, threatening hiss. "I've been looking for you. We need to have a conversation about the discrepancies in your recent pharmacy requisitions, and perhaps about why you're spending your nights behind a locked door with a criminal instead of filing the mandatory incident reports I requested." Peggy tried to pull her arm back, her heart hammering. "Mr. Vance, I am acting under the direct orders of the Chief of Staff and the patient's legal counsel. If you have questions about the care—" "I don't care about the care," Vance snapped, leaning in until she could smell the peppermint on his breath, a cloying scent that did nothing to mask his aggression. "I care about the liability, and I care about the fact that you think you can hide behind that monster. You're a little girl playing in a grown man's game, Peggy. One phone call from me, and your career isn't just over, it's a crime scene. Now you're going to give me the access codes to that suite, or I'll have security drag you out of here in handcuffs." Peggy felt the familiar cold prickle of fear, the same helplessness that had kept her subservient to the hospital's hierarchy for years. She looked around for help, but the other nurses suddenly found themselves very busy with paperwork. The shift in the atmosphere happened before she even heard the footsteps. The air in the hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees. From the shadow of the doorway of room 402, Su Jin's primary lieutenant, the man with the scarred knuckles, stepped into the light. Behind him, another guard materialized, their presence turning the sterile hallway into a combat zone. The lieutenant didn't run. He walked with a slow, deliberate lethality that made Vance's grip on Peggy's arm falter. "Let go of the lady," the lieutenant said. It wasn't a request, it was a statement of fact, delivered with the hollow, terrifying tone of someone who had ended lives for far less. Vance straightened his back, trying to summon his waning authority. "Do you have any idea who I am? I am the vice chairman of this—" The lieutenant moved with a speed that defied his size. In one fluid motion, he was in Vance's space, his hand catching the man's silk tie and twisting it until Vance was forced onto his tiptoes. The other guard stepped in front of Peggy, forming a human wall between her and the conflict. "We know exactly who you are, Harold," the lieutenant whispered, his face inches from Vance's. "You're the man who thinks a title makes his skin bulletproof. You're also the man whose offshore accounts are currently being emptied into a charity for retired police dogs. The boss doesn't like it when people touch his things, and right now, the nurse is the most valuable thing he owns." Vance's face went from pale to a sickly shade of purple. He clawed at his tie, his eyes darted to the security cameras, but the guards didn't seem to care. They were ghosts in a system they had already dismantled. "If you so much as breathe in her direction again," the lieutenant continued, his voice dropping to a jagged growl, "we won't go after your career. We'll go after everything you've ever loved. Do we have an understanding, or do I need to show you what an incident report looks like in our world?" The lieutenant released the tie. Vance stumbled back, gasping for air, his dignity shattered in front of the very staff he had bullied for years. He didn't say another word. He turned and fled toward the elevators, his expensive shoes squeaking frantically on the linoleum.
The guard in front of Peggy turned around. His expression didn't soften, but his posture relaxed. "The boss says you're not to be bothered, Nurse Martin. From now on, anyone who has a problem with you has a problem with him." Peggy stood there, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She looked at the nurses at the station, the ones who had stayed silent, and saw the new look in their eyes. It wasn't pity anymore. It was fear. She walked back into the suite, her legs feeling like lead. Soo-jin was sitting up, watching the news on a silent television. He didn't look up when she entered, but a small, dark smile played at the corners of his mouth. "He won't trouble you again," Soo-jin said, his voice a calm, resonant hum. "You didn't have to do that," Peggy whispered, her hands trembling as she set the saline on the counter. "You just made things worse for me with the board." "The board is a house of cards, Peggy. I just blew on it," Soo-jin replied, finally turning his obsidian gaze toward her. He reached out, his fingers tracing the faint red marks Vance's grip had left on her arm. "In my world, protection isn't a policy, it's a promise. You saved my life in that alley. Now get used to the fact that I've decided your life is worth more than a hospital's reputation." For the first time, Peggy realized the true nature of her golden handcuffs. It wasn't just that she couldn't leave, it was that she was beginning to realize that the monsters outside the room were far more terrifying than the one inside it. And for a woman who had spent her life being stepped on, the weight of Soo-jin's protection felt like a dangerous, addictive kind of power. The atmosphere in the VIP wing was always heavy, but today it felt like the air had been replaced by cold lead. Peggy was adjusting the tension on Soo-jin's surgical drain when the rhythmic click of expensive heels and the heavy tread of several men echoed from the corridor. Usually, the guards outside room 402 were a silent, immovable barrier, but today she heard the low murmur of a tense negotiation, followed by the slow, deliberate opening of the heavy oak doors. A man stepped into the room, draped in a coat of charcoal wool that looked soft enough to be silk. He was older than Soo-jin, with silvered temples and a face that seemed carved from a piece of weathered granite. This was Han Sung, Soo-jin's second-in-command. The man Soo-jin had whispered was the likely architect of the alleyway ambush. "Soo-jin," Han Sung said, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone that didn't quite hide the predatory edge beneath. "The family has been unrestless. They told me you were hovering at death's door, yet here you are, looking as though you've simply taken a very expensive nap." Peggy's breath hitched. Her hands remained steady as she swapped out a fresh bag of saline, but her skin prickled with the sensation of Han Sung's eyes moving toward her. He didn't look at her like a person. He looked at her like a piece of evidence that needed to be suppressed. "I'm hard to kill, Han Sung. You, of all people, should know that," Soo-jin replied, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He didn't move a muscle, but the power radiating from him filled the space between the bed and the visitor like a physical wall. Han Sung stepped closer, bypassing the perimeter of the bed to stand directly beside Peggy. The scent of expensive tobacco and something metallic, like a recently fired gun, clung to him. "And this must be the little miracle worker the hospital is whispering about, the one who works in the dark." He reached out a hand, his fingers hovering just inches from Peggy's shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of comfort, it was a threat. Peggy felt the blood drain from her face. She knew that this man had likely authorized the poisoned IV, and she knew that if she showed even a flicker of the truth in her eyes, neither she nor Soo-jin would see the sunrise. "She's a nurse, Han Sung, not a miracle worker," Soo-jin said, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with a warning that made the guards at the door shift their weight. "She does her job. I suggest you do yours." "Of course," Han Sung murmured, finally dropping his hand. He turned his gaze back to Soo-jin, but his smile remained fixed on Peggy. "It's just rare to find such loyalty in a stranger. It makes one wonder what she's been promised in return for her silence." Peggy kept her head down, focusing on the drip rate of the IV, her heart hammering against her ribs so loudly she feared they could hear it. She could feel Han Sung's scrutiny, a cold, calculating heat. He was looking for a crack, a sign of fear, a reason to eliminate the only witness who knew Soo-jin hadn't just been lucky, but had been saved by someone the syndicate couldn't control. She's promised nothing but her life, Han-sung, which is more than I can say for some of the men on my payroll, Soo-jin said. Han-sung laughed, a dry, hollow sound. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy envelope, tossing it onto the bedside table. A token from the associates to speed along your recovery. We wouldn't want you away from the office for too long. Things have a way of changing when the chair is empty. He turned to leave, but as he passed Peggy, he leaned in, his voice a whisper meant only for her. Be careful, Nurse Martin. In this city, the people who save lives are often the first ones to lose their own. The doors thudded shut behind him, leaving the room in a ringing silence. Peggy let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her knees trembling so violently she had to catch the edge of the bed to stay upright. Soo-jin's hand shot out, catching her wrist. His grip was a lifeline, grounding her. He pulled her closer, his obsidian eyes burning with an incandescent rage that wasn't directed at her, but at the ghost of the man who had just left. "He knows," Peggy whispered, her voice cracking. "He knows I saw the wound. He knows I know it wasn't a random hit." "He suspects," Soo-jin corrected, his fingers tightening protectively around her arm. "But as long as you are under my shadow, he can't touch you without declaring war. You held your ground, Peggy. You didn't blink." Peggy looked at the door, then back at the man who was both her captor and her only shield. She had just looked into the eyes of a murderer and survived, but as the adrenaline began to fade, a new, sharper terror took its place. She wasn't just Soo-jin's nurse anymore. She was the only thing standing between him and the man who wanted his throne, and in the Mafia's ledger, that made her the biggest target in Chicago. The moon was a sliver of bone hanging over the Chicago skyline, casting long, skeletal shadows across the VIP suite. Inside, the usual hospital hum had faded into a heavy, intimate silence, broken only by the rhythmic mechanical sigh of the ventilator in the hallway and the distant, lonely siren of a police cruiser blocks away. Peggy sat in the armchair by the window, the glow of her tablet illuminating the tired lines around her eyes, but her gaze kept drifting to the bed.
Soo-jin wasn't sleeping. He rarely did at this hour. He was propped up against the pillows, the covers pulled down to his waist, exposing the intricate tapestry of ink that covered his torso. In the dim light, the tattoos seemed to move with every shallow breath he took. Dragons coiling around his ribs, lotus flowers blooming over old bullet scars, and geometric patterns that looked like the blueprints of a fortress. "You're staring again, Peggy," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that felt like a touch in the dark. "I'm assessing the wound site," she lied softly, though she didn't move to get her stethoscope. "The inflammation seems to be receding." Soo-jin let out a huff of air that might have been a laugh if it didn't hurt so much. He gestured to a large black-inked tiger that prowled across his left side, its claws appearing to dig into the very skin she had sutured. "This one? I got it when I was 19. The night I realized that in my family, you either become the predator or you end up as the meat." Peggy leaned forward, drawn in by the rare vulnerability in his tone. "Is that what they all are? Warnings?" "Memories," Soo-jin corrected. He traced a long, jagged scar that cut through the center of a traditional shield tattoo on his forearm. "This isn't just ink. It's a ledger. Every time I lost someone, or every time I had to take a life to protect the throne, I added to the map. People think a crown is made of gold. In the syndicate, it's made of lead and scar tissue." He looked out the window at the city he ruled, his eyes reflecting the cold, distant lights. "My father died in a room like this, only there was no nurse to hold the line for him. Just men with pens, waiting for him to stop breathing so they could sign his life away. I spent 10 years making sure no one would ever stand over me like that.
but the heavier the crown gets, the harder it is to keep your head above the water." Peggy stood up and walked to the bedside, her movements quiet and fluid. She reached out, her fingers hovering just above the ink on his ribs. "Is that why you don't trust the hospital staff? Because they remind you of the men with pens?" "I don't trust them because they see the tattoos and the title, and they think they know the man." Soo-jin's obsidian gaze locked onto hers. He reached out and caught her hand, his palm warm and rough against her skin. "You're the only one who looks at the ink and asks what it means instead of how much it costs to buy my favor." "I see a man who's tired of carrying the weight," Peggy whispered, her heart skipping a beat as his thumb traced the back of her hand. The air in the room grew thick, charged with the kind of honesty that only exists at 3 a.m. between two people who shouldn't have met. Soo-jin pulled her slightly closer, his presence overwhelming the clinical scent of the room with the smell of wood smoke and rain.
"The secrets on this skin, they're the only things that are truly mine," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And now they're yours too. You saved the man, Peggy. Now you have to live with the ghosts he carries." He let go of her hand, but the connection remained, a tether in the dark. Peggy realized then that she wasn't just healing his flesh, she was becoming the vault for the parts of him he never showed the world. The golden handcuffs didn't just bind her to his bedside, they bound her to his history. As she sat back down, watching the rise and fall of his chest, she knew the weight he spoke of was starting to pull at her, too. In the quiet of the night, the line between the nurse and the Mafia boss had blurred into something far more dangerous, a shared secret. The stillness of the VIP wing had always felt artificial, but tonight it felt like a trap. Peggy was midway through checking Soo-jin's temperature when the world simply vanished. The low, comforting hum of the hospital, the white noise of the HVAC, the rhythmic beep of the monitors, the soft glow of the recessed lighting ceased instantly. In its place was a silence so absolute it felt physical, followed by a darkness that swallowed the room whole. Peggy's hand remained on Soo-jin's forehead, her fingers feeling the sudden sharp spike in his tension. "Peggy," he whispered, his voice a low, warning rasp in the dark. "The power's out. It's okay," she said, her voice trembling despite her attempts to sound clinical. "The backup generators will kick in. It takes 10 seconds, just 10 seconds." She counted them in her head, 1, 2, 3. But as the clock in her mind hit 10, 20, then 30, the hospital remained a tomb. No emergency red lights flickered on. No mechanical roar of the basement generators echoed through the vents. The silence persisted, heavy and suffocating. "They aren't coming on," Soo-jin said. It wasn't a guess, it was an assessment of an ambush. Outside the heavy oak doors, Peggy heard the frantic, muffled sounds of the hallway. The guards were no longer standing at silent attention. She heard the metallic slide of a round being chambered, and the low, urgent hiss of a radio that was only emitting static. "They've jammed the frequencies," Soo-jin growled. He sat up in bed, the effort causing a sharp intake of breath as his sutures protested. "They didn't just cut the lines, Peggy. They took the fail-safes. This isn't a blackout. It's a siege." Peggy reached for her emergency penlight, the thin beam of LED light cutting a frantic path through the room. She swept it across Soo-jin's face. His obsidian eyes were wide, alert, and terrifyingly focused. She then moved it to the monitors. They were black. The life support systems were dead. A sudden sharp pop echoed from the corridor, the unmistakable sound of a suppressed gunshot, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the linoleum. Peggy's breath hitched in her throat. Her world of healing was being systematically dismantled by the sound of killing. "Get down," Soo-jin commanded. He reached out, his hand finding her arm in the dark and pulling her toward the floor. "Get away from the door and stay below the level of the glass." "I have to check the hall. Maybe someone is hurt," Peggy whispered, her nurse's instinct fighting a losing battle against the sheer terror rising in her chest. "The people in the hall are already dead, or they're the ones doing the killing," Sujin said, his voice cold and flat. He was no longer the patient, he was the general. "This is Han Sung. He's waited for the cover of night and the failure of the system. He knows I can't move, and he knows the hospital security is useless in the dark." Another shot rang out, closer this time, followed by the sound of the heavy fire doors at the end of the wing being forced open. The rhythmic, heavy tread of tactical boots began to march down the hallway, a steady, predatory beat that signaled the arrival of a professional hit team. Peggy huddled on the floor beside the bed, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard it was the only thing she could hear. The smell of ozone from the fried electrical system mingled with the copper scent of Sujin's old blood and the new, terrifying scent of fear. "They're coming for us," she breathed, the reality of the sabotage finally sinking in. The hospital wasn't a sanctuary. The golden cage had just become a kill box. "No," Sujin said, his hand tightening on hers until it almost hurt. "They're coming for me, but they have to go through you to get here. Do you have the shears I saw you use in the alley?" Peggy fumbled for her scrub pocket, her fingers closing around the cold, heavy steel of her trauma shears. "Yes. Keep them in your hand," he whispered. "The lights are out, Peggy. The rules are gone. If that door opens and it isn't one of my men, you don't think, you just cut." In the distance, the first scream echoed through the darkened wing, and Peggy realized that the do-no-harm oath she had lived by her entire life was about to be buried in the shadows of room 402. The sabotage was complete, the wolves were in the house, and the only light left in the world was the thin, dying beam of her penlight reflecting in the boss's eyes. The darkness of the VIP wing was no longer silent. It was screaming with the rhythmic, heavy cracks of gunfire echoing up from the lobby. The vibration of the building's foundation told Peggy that the heavy-caliber weapons had arrived. The hospital, once a sanctuary of soft whispers and rubber-soled shoes, had become a hollowed-out drum for the sounds of war. "Peggy, get the chair," Sujin commanded, his voice a low, focused anchor in the chaos. "You can't sit up, Sujin. You'll tear the internal repairs," she whispered, her hands fumbling in the dark for the manual release of the heavy transport chair. "If I stay in this bed, I'm a stationary target. Move, or we both die here." Peggy didn't argue. The rules of medicine had been replaced by the rules of survival. She threw her weight into the bedside lever, the mechanical whine of the bed frame sounding like a siren in the pitch-black room. With the strength born of pure adrenaline, she guided Sujin's massive frame into the chair. He let out a strangled hiss of pain, his hand gripping her shoulder so hard she felt her collarbone creak, but he didn't cry out.
A sudden flash of light strobed in the hallway, the muzzle flash of a submachine gun, followed by the heavy thud of the suite's outer doors being kicked in. "Go, the service exit behind the nurse's station," Sujin rasped. Peggy grabbed the handles of the chair and pushed. The wheels squeaked on the linoleum, a sound that felt loud enough to alert every killer in the building. As they burst into the hallway, the scene was a nightmare of strobe light violence. Emergency glow sticks had been cracked and tossed on the floor, casting a sickly neon green hue over the bodies of the guards she had seen every morning. Near the elevators, she saw the man with the scarred knuckles, Sujin's lieutenant, crouched behind a heavy marble planter. He was firing back toward the stairwell, the brass casings from his weapon dancing on the floor like golden rain. "Down the service ramp!" The lieutenant roared over the deafening clatter of a shootout. "Don't stop for anything!" Peggy didn't look back. She sprinted, her lungs burning with the scent of gunpowder and ozone. The service elevator was tucked behind a heavy steel door marked laundry and maintenance. It was a part of the hospital she had barely noticed in her 3 years of service, but now it was the only vein of hope left. The hallway behind them erupted in a fresh wave of glass shards and splintered wood.
Peggy felt a hot sting on her cheek as a stray fragment grazed her, but she kept her head down, her eyes locked on the gray steel of the elevator doors. "The freight lift runs on a separate hydraulic circuit," Sujin whispered, his breath coming in ragged gasps. She reached the door and slammed her hand against the manual override. For a terrifying 5 seconds, nothing happened. The sound of boots on the linoleum was getting closer. The killers were moving past the nurse's station. Peggy gripped the handles of the chair, her knuckles white, her heart a frantic drum in her ears. Clang! The heavy doors groaned open. Peggy shoved the chair inside just as a spray of bullets pockmarked the wall beside the frame. She scrambled inside and hit the basement button with her elbow, her hands never leaving Sujin. As the elevator began its slow, shuddering descent, the sounds of the battle faded into a muffled, distant roar. In the small, dim light of the lift, Peggy looked down at her patient. Her surgical gown was soaked through with fresh blood. The strain had reopened the wound. "You're bleeding again," she sobbed, her professional composure finally shattering in the confined space. Sujin reached up, his bloody hand catching hers, pinning it against the cold steel of the elevator wall. He looked at her, his eyes dark with a fierce, terrifying pride. "You're not just a nurse anymore, Peggy Martin. You're a soldier, and soldiers don't cry until the objective is secured." The lift shuddered to a halt, the doors opening into the humid, echoing depths of the laundry basement. The ward of war was behind them, but as the steam from the industrial pipes swirled around them, Peggy realized they had simply descended into a deeper level of hell. She gripped the handles and pushed him out into the dark, leaving the woman she used to be on the floor of the elevator. The basement air was thick with the smell of scorched lint and damp concrete. Peggy pushed the chair with a strength she didn't know she possessed, the heavy wheels rattling over the uneven floor of the laundry room. Behind them, the muffled echoes of the shootout above were being replaced by a closer, more terrifying sound, the rhythmic clack-clack of boots descending the service stairs. "In there," Sujin hissed, pointing a trembling hand toward a heavy steel door labeled Central Supply, Restricted Access. Peggy swung the chair inside and kicked the door shut, just as a beam of a tactical flashlight swept across the hallway. She engaged the manual deadbolt, the iron sliding into place with a finality that made her stomach flip. The room was a narrow labyrinth of floor-to-ceiling metal shelves, packed with boxes of gauze, gallon jugs of antiseptic, and rows of sterile instrument kits. It smelled of rubbing alcohol and silence.
Sujin's breathing was a wet, ragged sound in the dark. He slumped forward, his forehead resting against the cold metal of the supply shelf.
"Peggy, they're going to blow the lock. You need to leave me. There's a ventilation duct in the back corner." "Be quiet,"
she whispered, her voice cracking. She wasn't listening. She was looking at his side. The fresh blood was dark, nearly black in the dim emergency light, blooming across his bandages like an ink blot. A heavy blow struck the door. The steel groaned. Peggy's mind raced through 3 years of anatomy and 2 years of trauma rotations. She looked at the shelves around her. She didn't have a gun, and she didn't have the strength to fight a professional assassin, but she knew the human body. She knew where the wires were hidden and how easily they could be cut. She reached for a sealed surgical tray on the middle shelf, ripping the plastic open with her teeth. She pulled out a number 10 scalpel, a small, unassuming piece of high-grade steel. Beside it, she grabbed a bottle of concentrated ammonia and a handful of surgical towels. The door shuddered again. A localized charge detonated, the sound deafening in the small space, and the lock disintegrated. The door swung open, and a man stepped in. He was dressed in charcoal tactical gear, his face obscured by a balaclava, a suppressed pistol held level. He didn't hesitate. He aimed straight for the man in the chair. "Hey!" Peggy screamed. The assassin flinched, his eyes darting toward her. In that split second of distraction, Peggy hurled the open bottle of ammonia directly at his face.
The caustic liquid sprayed across his eyes and lungs. He let out a choked, gagging sound, dropping his weapon as he clawed at his burning face. Peggy didn't stop. She moved with a cold, clinical precision that bypassed her fear. She knew exactly where the femoral artery sat, just beneath the skin of the inner thigh. She knew that a deep enough incision there would cause a person to lose consciousness in less than a minute. As the man stumbled, blinded and gasping, Peggy lunged. She didn't stab blindly. She held the scalpel like the precision tool it was. She drove the blade into the soft tissue of his leg, right where the pulse beat strongest, and pulled. The resistance of the muscle felt like thick silk. She felt the hot, pressurized spray of blood hit her arm, a different sensation than the rain in the alley. This wasn't a save. This was a tactical deconstruction of a human being. The assassin fell to his knees, his hands moving instinctively to the massive fountain of red gushing from his thigh. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with a shock that transcended pain. He had expected a victim. He had found a surgeon. Peggy stood over him, the scalpel trembling in her hand, her scrubs painted in a macabre map of crimson. She watched the light fade from his eyes as his blood pressure plummeted, his body going limp on the cold tile. The silence returned heavier than before. Peggy looked down at her hands. The do-no-harm oath she had carried like a shield for years lay shattered on the floor next to the dying man. She had used her knowledge of life to deliver death. "Peggy," Sujin rasped. He was watching her, his expression a mixture of agony and profound, dark reverence. She turned to him, her face a mask of wet blood and stone. She didn't cry, she didn't tremble. She simply picked up a fresh roll of gauze and walked back to his chair. "The artery is severed. He's gone," she said, her voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. She knelt beside Sujin, her bloody fingers beginning to work on his bandages with the same steady rhythm she had used in the alley. "We have to move. There will be more of them." Sujin reached out, his hand covering hers, his thumb tracing the blood on her knuckles. "You broke your rules for me." "I did what was necessary," Peggy replied, looking him in the eye. The softness was gone, replaced with a sharp, lethal edge. "Now let's get you out of here before I have to do it again."
She had spent her life being the woman who fixed things, but as she pushed the chair over the cooling body of the assassin, Peggy realized that she had officially crossed the line. She was no longer just the nurse who saved the boss. She was the woman who would kill to keep him. The sirens of the city were distant now, a fading echo of the war that had consumed the night. Sunlight, cold and gray, began to crawl through the high windows of the safe house, a sprawling glass and steel fortress overlooking the lake. The air here didn't smell like antiseptic or blood. It smelled of expensive leather and the ozone of high-end security systems. Sujin sat in a high-backed chair, his silhouette cutting a sharp, imposing figure against the rising sun. He was no longer the dying man in the alley or the tethered patient in room 402. He wore a fresh silk shirt, left unbuttoned enough to reveal the pristine bandages Peggy had applied only hours before. His lieutenants stood in the shadows of the room, their heads bowed, the silence of the house serving as a testament to the brutal efficiency with which Sujin had reclaimed his crown. Han Sung was gone, his name already being scrubbed from the city's ledger. Peggy stood by the window, her hands tucked into the pockets of a clean sweater they had provided for her. Her own scrubs, the ones stained with the life and death of the previous night, had been burned. She felt lighter, yet infinitely heavier. The golden handcuffs were gone, but the ghost of the scalpel's edge still felt warm in her palm. "The hospital board has been reorganized," Sujin said, his voice a low, resonant hum that filled the expansive room. "Aristor is in custody. Your record has been wiped clean. In the eyes of the law and the medical board, you are a hero who survived a tragic terrorist event at the hospital. You can walk out of that front gate right now,
And by tomorrow, you'll have your old life back. The ER, the rules, the quiet shifts, it's all waiting for you." Peggy turned to look at him. He looked different now. The vulnerability of the night was replaced by a terrifying, polished power. Yet when his eyes met hers, she saw the obsidian depth that only she had truly been allowed to see. "And if I walk out?" Peggy asked, her voice steady. "Then you are a stranger to me," Soo-jin replied, his gaze never wavering. "I will ensure you are protected, but you will never see me again. You will go back to being a woman who follows the lines, healing people who will never know your name." He stood up slowly, the movement fluid and controlled. He walked toward her, the power in his stride making the guards in the shadows stiffen. He stopped just inches away, his presence a physical heat that bypassed the chill of the morning air. "But there is a second choice," he whispered, reaching out to catch a stray lock of her hair. "Stay, not as a nurse and not as a prisoner. Stay as the only person in this city who doesn't answer to me, the only one I answer to. My men bow to the throne, Peggy, but I only bow to you." The weight of the offer hung between them, more profound than any threat he had ever made. He was offering her a seat beside the devil, a life where the rules were whatever she decided they were. He was offering her the power to save or destroy, backed by the full might of his shadow empire. Peggy looked at her hands. They were the hands of a healer, but they were also the hands that had severed an artery to protect a monster. She realized that the woman who had walked into that alley a week ago no longer existed. That Peggy Martin believed in the system. This Peggy Martin knew that the system was a lie.
"You're a dangerous man, Soo-jin," she said softly. "And you're a dangerous woman, Peggy Martin. You just needed someone to give you a reason to be," he replied, his hand moving from her hair to the nape of her neck, his thumb tracing the spot where her pulse was now slow, calm, and certain. The silence of the room stretched, the city below beginning to wake up, oblivious to the fact that its new order had been decided in a basement supply closet. Peggy looked at the door leading back to her old life, then back at the man who had rewritten her soul in the dark. "I'm done with the rules," Peggy said, her voice dropping to a low, decisive vibration. Soo-jin's dark eyes flared with a sudden, triumphant light. He didn't smile, but the look he gave her was one of absolute, terrifying devotion. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, a silent pact sealed in the light of a new day. "Then let's show them," Soo-jin whispered. "Let's show them what happens when the saint and the sinner decide to run the world together." Peggy didn't look back at the door. She reached up, her fingers locking with his, and together they turned to face the city. The ward of war was over. The reign of the shadow nurse had begun.